Hungary's election has sent a fresh jolt through Canada's trade and security calculations, with the political shift in Budapest potentially clearing the path for a long-stalled EU deal that could unlock billions of dollars in market access, energy cooperation, and defense ties. The timing matters. If the new leadership changes Hungary's position on the agreement, Ottawa could finally move from diplomatic waiting room to actual delivery. For Canada, this is not just another European election result. It is a possible reset button on a deal that has been blocked, delayed, and politically gaslit by years of friction inside the European Union, where one country's objections have been enough to stall broader gains. Now, with Viktor Orban weakened and a new force rising under Peter Magyar, officials in Ottawa and Brussels are watching closely for the kind of vote that can change the entire board. The stakes are not abstract. Canada has spent years treating Europe as a strategic hedge against an increasingly volatile U.S. trade environment, and the EU file has carried real economic weight in that plan. A breakthrough could matter for exporters, energy planners, and defense policymakers alike, especially as Ottawa looks for more reliable partners on critical minerals, supply chains, and security coordination. What makes this moment different is that Hungary's vote could affect far more than Hungary. If Budapest shifts from obstruction to cooperation, a blocked EU-Canada trade path could reopen, and with it, a broader agenda that includes energy, resilience, and security cooperation worth billions. One vote could reshape Canada-EU strategy. For 16 years, Viktor Orban turned Hungary into the European Union's go-to blocker, using Budapest's veto power to stall decisions that mattered far beyond its borders, including Canada's long-delayed Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, ratification. The result was a slow-motion policy jam that frustrated Ottawa's trade, defense, and diplomatic priorities, while one member state kept the whole file parked in the hallway. The mechanics were simple and brutal. Hungary did not need to defeat the deal outright. It only needed to keep objections alive long enough to delay final approval. And in the EU system, that kind of obstruction can be enough to freeze progress for years. That is how a trade agreement that Canada and the European Commission had already treated as a strategic win ended up trapped in political limbo, with business groups, ministers, and diplomats left doing the same tired dance, waiting, rebriefing, and pretending the file was still moving. Orban's broader style made the problem worse. Over his 16-year run, he built a reputation for treating EU consensus like a negotiation with a Karen at customer service. Loud, persistent, and designed to make everyone else cave first. Whether the issue was rule of law, sanctions, migration, or external agreements, Hungary repeatedly signaled that it would use its leverage to extract concessions or slow the machine. And that habit made Brussels increasingly wary of any file that needed unanimous political patience. For Canada, that meant more than just a trade headache. CETA was supposed to be a flagship bridge into Europe, offering wider access for exporters, cleaner rules for investors, and a stronger transatlantic footing at a time when Ottawa was trying to diversify away from U.S. volatility. Instead, the ratification process got dragged into the EU's internal politics, where Hungary's resistance became one more reminder that a single government in Budapest could complicate a deal, touching tariffs, procurement, services, and regulatory cooperation. The delay also undercut Canada's defense and diplomatic planning. Ottawa has been trying to deepen security ties with European partners as the war in Ukraine reshapes the continent's priorities. But a stalled trade file sends the opposite signal, that Europe is interested in partnership, just not always in execution. That gap matters in practice, because trade deals and security relationships often move together, and when one gets stuck, the other starts looking like a talking point instead of a strategy. The political cost in Brussels was just as real. EU officials have spent years trying to manage Orban's veto politics without letting the entire bloc look hostage to one member state. And that has created a pattern of delay that spills across unrelated files. For Canada, the message was clear. Even when the substance was done, the process could still be held up by a government willing to weaponize procedure for leverage. That is why the Hungarian election mattered so much to Ottawa. A change in Budapest does not automatically fix CETA, but it changes the math around a file that had been trapped by one of the EU's most consistent spoilers. And if Hungary stops playing blocker in chief, the blockade may finally be ending. On April 13th, 2026, Hungary's election result gave opposition leader Magyar a commanding supermajority, setting up a rapid round of calls with European leaders and sending an immediate political signal that Budapest may be moving back toward the EU mainstream. In Brussels, the reaction was fast and practical. Officials and diplomats began reading the vote not as a symbolic upset, but as a potential reset in one of the bloc's most disruptive capitals. Magyar's victory matters because the scale of the mandate changes, the arithmetic at home and abroad. A supermajority gives a new government room to move quickly on legislation, cabinet changes, and institutional reforms, which is exactly what European partners want to see after years of friction over rule of law disputes, sanctions, fights, and policy vetoes. The message from the first hours after the vote was simple. Hungary is no longer being discussed as a permanent spoiler, but as a country that might be willing to rejoin the room instead of holding the door shut. The diplomatic pace picked up almost immediately. According to European officials familiar with the calls, Magyar spoke with multiple EU leaders on the day of the result, including counterparts in key Western capitals that have been waiting for a clearer signal from Budapest. Those conversations were not ceremonial. They were a test of whether Hungary's new political center of gravity would translate into concrete alignment on EU priorities, and from Ukraine's support to trade files that have been stuck in procedural mud. That shift is politically significant because Brussels has spent years treating Hungary as the member state most likely to turn consensus into a hostage situation. Now, the same institutions that learned to brace for delay are being forced to update their playbook. If Magyar uses the supermajority to restore a more cooperative posture, the effect could ripple beyond Hungary's borders and into the EU's broader decision-making culture, which has been strained by repeated veto threats and last-minute bargaining. The timing also matters for Canada and other partners watching the EU from the outside. When one member state stops acting like the entire bloc's permanent roadblock, files that were frozen for political reasons can suddenly look movable again. That includes trade and strategic cooperation dossiers where the substance has long been ready, but the politics kept getting in the way. For now, the result is being treated in Brussels as more than a domestic Hungarian story. It is a signal, and not a subtle one, that the balance may be shifting back toward a more conventional European alignment. After years of confrontation and procedural sabotage, Brussels is already reading the result. Hungary's political shift is now moving from symbolism to procedure, with Brussels and Ottawa both watching the same narrow ratification track that could turn a stalled trade file into a near-complete agreement. As of mid-April 2026, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement has 17 approvals completed and 10 still outstanding, while roughly 99% of tariffs are already set to disappear once the final chain is finished. That matters because the remaining steps are no longer about the core economics. The deal has already been provisionally applied for years, which means most market access benefits are on the table. What remains is the formal ratification sequence in the last holdout jurisdictions, where domestic politics can still slow or stop the paperwork. In other words, the heavy lifting is done. But the final stretch is still vulnerable to one more political mood swing. For Canada, that is exactly why Hungary's new direction is being read as more than a local reset. Ottawa has spent years pushing to diversify trade beyond the United States, where uncertainty over tariffs, elections, and policy reversals has kept Canadian planners in permanent risk management mode. The CETA file is one of the clearest routes to that diversification, giving Canada deeper access to a market of more than 450 million consumers without having to beg for stability from Washington like it is some kind of corporate Karen with a veto button. The political logic is straightforward. If Budapest stops acting like a procedural brake inside the EU, the remaining approvals become easier to line up, and the agreement's near total tariff elimination can finally harden into something fully durable that would not just help exporters in sectors like machinery, agri-food, and services. It would also strengthen Canada's argument that Europe can serve as a serious counterweight when the U.S. relationship gets messy. Officials familiar with the file say the remaining ratifications are being treated as a chain reaction, not a single vote. One approval can reduce the pressure on the next, while any delay can give opponents room to gaslight the process with fresh objections or procedural excuses. That is why diplomats are watching Hungary so closely. If the new government keeps moving in the same direction, the trade gains now depend on one more ratification chain. Canada's energy and trade strategy is now colliding with Europe's security agenda as LNG Canada's export ramp up, the European Union's planned 2027 ban on Russian LNG imports, and Ottawa's push to expand Europe-facing shipments converge. In one policy lane, the result is a cleaner commercial pitch for Canada, but also a more strategic one. Energy, security, and industrial policy are starting to look like the same file. That shift is not theoretical. LNG Canada, the country's flagship liquefied natural gas project on the Pacific coast, is designed to give Canada a larger role in global supply chains at a time when Europe is trying to cut its remaining dependence on Russian energy. The EU has already signaled that Russian LNG should be phased out by 2027, a move that opens space for alternative suppliers and gives Canadian exporters a fresh political argument in Brussels. That is where the security side enters the room and refuses to leave. Under the security action framework being discussed between Canada and European partners, energy cooperation is no longer just about molecules and contracts. It is about resilience, supply stability, and reducing exposure to coercive suppliers. The commercial logic is obvious, but the political logic is even louder. If Europe is serious about locking out Russian LNG by 2027, then countries that can deliver reliable non-Russian supply gain leverage not only in energy talks, but in broader economic coordination. LNG Canada also matters because it gives the country a physical answer to a geopolitical question. A project like this is not just an industrial asset. It is a proof point that Canada can move energy across the Pacific into markets that are actively trying to de-risk from authoritarian suppliers. The security framework is what turns that from trade talk into policy architecture. Canadian and European officials have been working on ways to connect energy, resilience, defense cooperation, and supply chain protection in a more coordinated way, so that LNG, critical minerals, infrastructure, and industrial standards are not treated as separate silos. The idea is simple enough. If the same countries are exposed to the same threats, they should stop pretending their solutions belong in different rooms. For Canada, that also changes how Europe is viewed inside the broader diversification strategy. The point is not just to sell more gas, but to embed Canadian exports inside a transatlantic system that rewards reliability and punishes disruption. That is a much bigger deal than one cargo or one terminal, because it gives Ottawa a chance to turn trade policy into geopolitical insurance. Industry analysts say the next test is whether the politics can keep up with the infrastructure, LNG Canada's growth, the EU's 2027 deadline, and the security framework all point in the same direction. But the actual gains will depend on permitting, shipping capacity, financing, and whether European buyers sign long-term contracts instead of treating Canada like a nice idea with good branding. In other words, the spreadsheet still has to survive the real world. Still, the direction of travel is hard to miss. Canada is increasingly being pulled into Europe's energy security conversation, not as a courtesy guest, but as a supplier with strategic value. And that makes the ratification track in Brussels and the export track in Ottawa look more connected than ever. Hungary's political reset on April 13, 2026 is now being treated in Brussels and Ottawa as more than a domestic upset. It is a practical opening for Canada's stalled trade, defense, and energy agenda with the European Union. With Peter Magyar signaling a pro-Europe pivot and Viktor Orban's populist bloc losing its grip, officials on both sides are recalculating what can move, what can be ratified, and what can finally get done. For Canada, the shift matters because it removes one of the most persistent political roadblocks to the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, and gives supporters of the deal a cleaner path to finish the job. The broader prize is not symbolic. Ottawa has been pushing to reduce its over-reliance on the United States, and a functioning transatlantic trade lane offers a second market that is larger, more stable, and less likely to change the rules mid-game. Like a bad reality show producer, that economic case is now colliding with a defense and security argument that has become harder to ignore. European officials are increasingly focused on supply chain resilience, critical minerals, and energy security. And Canada's positioning itself as a partner that can deliver on all three without the usual geopolitical gaslighting. In that context, the 146 billion Canadian dollar opportunity tied to deeper Canada-EU commercial ties is being framed not as a wish list, but as a package of trade, industrial, and security gains that can be measured in contracts, jobs, and strategic redundancy. The timing also helps explain why Magyar's rise is being watched so closely. A government in Budapest that is less interested in blocking consensus and more interested in aligning with Europe could ease pressure on other member states that have been waiting for political cover to move forward. That does not mean every approval will suddenly glide through on autopilot, but it does mean the old Orban-era chokehold is weakening, and with it, the argument that Canada's Europe strategy is forever stuck in bureaucratic limbo. For exporters, defense planners, and policymakers, the message is straightforward. Europe is looking for dependable partners, and Canada is trying to prove it can be one. If Magyar sustains the pro-EU course and the remaining CETA ratification steps continue to advance, Ottawa could gain a more durable foothold in a market that wants cleaner energy, stronger industrial links, and fewer security vulnerabilities. The result would be a transatlantic relationship built less on speeches and more on leverage, logistics, and long-term stability. Analysts say the real test now is whether political momentum turns into operational delivery. That means contracts signed, approvals completed, and defense and trade coordination translated into actual policy rather than glossy talking points. If that happens, Canada's role in Europe will no longer be defined by what it hopes to sell, but by what it can anchor in a shifting geopolitical order. Canada may be entering a new geopolitical phase.